Section 4 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 8. Mrs. St. Clair Stobart. No woman has seen the war at closer quarters and in more varied fields of action than Mrs. St. Clair Stobart, and no one has worked harder to help the sick and wounded, on the field, in besieged fortresses, at base hospitals, and in the stricken villages of a ravaged and invaded country. Everywhere she has sought and found her opportunity to bear her part in the actual campaign, a part such as no woman has ever taken before. The outbreak of war found Mrs. Stobart already trained, for she had gained her experience with the Woman's Convoy Corps, which she founded, and which did such successful work in the Balkan War in 1912-1913. Early in August 1914, therefore, she was entrusted with the leadership of an ambulance unit under the organization of the St. John Ambulance Association, and proceeded at once to Brussels. Before a hospital could be established, the Germans had entered the city, and Mrs. Stobart escaped with difficulty, after having been actually a prisoner in German hands and condemned to be shot as a spy. Nothing daunted by her first experience, Mrs. Stobart then established a hospital in Antwerp. After 3 weeks of fine work, the town was besieged, and the bombardment began. The hospital was in the direct line of fire of one of the enemy's objectives, the ammunition depot. But under a storm of shell fire, Mrs. Stobart and her unit rescued their wounded and were themselves the last to leave the burning city, crossing the bridge of boats just before it was blown up. After the fall of Antwerp, Mrs. Stobart accepted an invitation from the French Red Cross to establish a hospital at Cherbourg. At first, the work was very heavy and the numbers of wounded enormous, but once it was started, Mrs. Stobart was able to leave the smoothly working hospital in good hands and to answer the call to help Serbia, then in such dire need. Accordingly, after spending some time in making her preparations, she traveled to Serbia in April 1915 with a fresh unit. On arrival, Mrs. Stobart began by establishing a camp hospital entirely consisting of tents at Kragujevac. It was the first experiment of this kind which had been tried, but the advantages of healthy outdoor conditions, as opposed to the alternative of insanitary buildings, were soon proved, for the hospital, which had been requested by the Serbian medical authorities to undertake surgical work, entirely escaped the scourge of typhus. Unfortunately, this was not so with regard to typhoid, from which several members of the staff died in June 1915, including the well-known author Mrs. Percy Dearmer, who, though far from strong, had offered her services to the unit and had already done fine work. During the first 3 months, the hospital undertook both civil and military cases, and Mrs. Stobart organized a further invaluable and successful scheme in establishing roadside tent dispensaries in 7 or 8 remote villages. Altogether, within a few weeks, 22,000 civilians received surgical and medical assistance. At the end of September 1915 came a signal proof of the confidence which Miss Stobart had inspired in Serbia. The army was preparing its fresh resistance to the second invasion, and the Bulgarians were on the eve of declaring war. Mrs. Stobart was approached by the Serbian military authorities and asked to mobilize a portion of her unit as a flying field hospital. She was appointed commander with the rank of major in the Serbian army, the first time in history that such an appointment has been given to a woman, and the unit, which was called the First Serbian English Field Hospital, was attached to the Šumadija Division, After making arrangements for the continuation of the work of the Krgujevac Hospital, Mrs. Stobart chose for the ambulance column a dozen of her English women doctors and nurses, motor ambulance drivers, a cook, orderlies, interpreters, and about 60 Serbian soldiers. On October 1, the column started for the Bulgarian front, traveling by train through Niš to Pirot. But after a few days of trekking in that direction, the column was ordered to move north with the division to within a few miles of Belgrade on the Danube front to face the stronger enemy, the Germans and the Austrians. On October 14, the hospital camp was pitched within sound of the guns, and the first batches of wounded were received. But the stand of the Serbian army was destined to be a short one. 2 days later, orders came to move southwards, and the first stage began of the great retreat, which was to continue steadily for 3 months. The life of the members of the field hospital during the retreat was indeed a strange one, for, ever on the march, stopping for a few hours to pitch a tent and attend to the wounded brought to them from the battlefields close at hand, evacuating them by motor ambulance to the nearest railway or hospital, and then marching on again. Throughout the retreat, Mrs. Stobart rode at the head of her column night and day, selecting every inch of their road, struggling for a place for them in the endless procession of the straggling host that beset the mud-sodden roads and slippery mountain paths, obtaining food for them and their horses with infinite difficulty in the deserted villages through which the column passed. Forced to snatch odd hours of sleep when and where they could, always fully dressed and prepared for the orders to march at any moment, they often narrowly escaped capture. The sound of the enemy guns was ever in their ears, the invading armies always at their heels. Mrs. Stobart truly proved herself a leader in fact as well as in name, for no trained commander of troops could have shown a higher courage or faced emergencies with a more decided energy than this Englishwoman. It was a cruel day for the hospital column when, at the end of a terrible forced march, during which Miss Stobart was 81 hours in the saddle, the motor ambulance and the hospital equipment had at last to be destroyed and abandoned at the foot of the Montenegrin mountains, through which Mrs. Stobart then led her skeleton column on foot. The horrors of the retreat increased every day, but the only way to safety had to be faced, though it lay over trackless mountains 8,000 feet high, through snow, ice, unbroken forests, and bridgeless rivers. It was then midwinter. Men and animals died by the roadside in hundreds from starvation and exposure. Writing of the retreat afterwards, Mrs. Stobart said, "Continued cold, exhaustion from forced marches, and increasing lack of food made the track a shambles. Men by the hundred lay dead from cold and hunger by the roadside, and no one could stop to bury them. But worse still, men lay dying by the roadside, dying from cold and hunger, and no one could stay to tend them." The whole scene was a combination of mental and physical misery, difficult to describe in words. No one knows, nor ever will know accurately, how many people perished, but it is believed that not less than 10,000 human beings lay sepulchred in those mountains. At last, on December 20, Mrs. Stobart had the triumph of leading her weary but courageous column into Scutari in Albania, without the loss of a single one of its members, the only commander who succeeded in bringing a column intact through the retreat. The chief officer of the Serbian medical staff expressed true sentiments when he wrote to Mrs. Stobart, "You have made everybody believe that a woman can overcome and endure all the war difficulties. You can be sure, esteemed madam, that you have won the sympathies of the whole of Serbia." 9. Miss E. G. Bather and Miss Dorothy Ravenscroft. Miss Bather is one of the women whose sporting experiences in pre-war days have turned to valuable account in the service of her country. Her knowledge of horses, gained in the enjoyment of hunting, has enabled her to undertake the serious and arduous work of running a remount depot for the War Office under Mr. Cecil Alden, M.F.H. Many girls who have hunted or had their own horses might think that they could easily do remount work, but it is not merely a case of being able to ride well. The riding is only the lightest part of the duties. It is a matter of settling down to a life of real hard work, requiring strength, courage, infinite patience, and firmness. That Miss Bather had been able to organize a depot successfully and carry on the work entirely with the help of girl workers for over 2 years is a tribute to any woman which can only be realized if the exact scope of the work is understood. The functions of workers at remount depots are to receive horses and mules which are sent to them and to make them fit for active service. The animals arrive mostly in rough condition, the horses being of all types, from the heavy draft horse to the colonel's charger. An expert has said, "To be able to do this work, a girl must love her horse for himself, but that is not everything. She must be practical, capable, strong, self-denying, and brave." The horses are usually sent to the depot in mixed batches of 30 or more, dirty in their coats, perhaps thin and out of condition, and often lame or suffering from various ailments. "It requires a lot of pluck in the first instance," writes Miss Bather, "to unload from the railway trucks, saddle up, and mount those horses that look as if they had been ridden lately, and ride them, each rider leading another horse, to their destination some 5 miles away. The grooming of the horses is hard work, and requires considerable strength, even when the horse is quiet. With wild and difficult horses it is necessary to hobble and muzzle them before grooming is possible. They are often deceptively quiet at first, and it may take a few days of bitter experience before the kickers and biters are discovered. Besides the daily grooming, which has to be performed for each horse like a child's toilette, there is clipping and singeing. After the grooming comes the work of keeping the stables, which must be cleaned out and disinfected daily, while the harness and tackle have to be cleaned and polished. There is also the care of the horses in sickness and convalescence, which requires particular skill and knowledge. With regard to the exercising, Miss Bather writes, "This is fraught with difficulties and anxieties, especially with a new lot of horses. To set the pace, someone responsible has to lead the straying with the quiet horses that will face the traffic. But though all army horses are supposed to be broken in, I have known our straying resemble a Wild West show." An eyewitness described an occasion when she happened to meet Miss Bather's lads out for exercising. One of the horses had taken fright, and breaking loose, had become entangled in barbed wire near the road. The onlooker states that the girls behaved with the utmost coolness, extricating the struggling horse with courage and skill, and successfully preventing a stampede among the other horses. During the first year of her work, about 500 horses passed through Miss Bather's depot, and in June 1917 she completed her second year of work. Miss Dorothy Ravenscroft is another lady who has been doing similar work for the War Office. She is responsible for a remount depot at Chester, where, with the help of 12 girl assistants, 40 horses at a time are prepared for active service. The horses are mostly officers' cobs and chargers, and, as at the other depots, the girl workers do the entire work of the stables, as well as the exercising, grooming, and feeding of the horses. The post of superintendent of a remount depot is one of considerable responsibility, for the success of a depot depends largely upon the personality of the responsible head. Her life is necessarily one of continual anxiety, not only for the horses, but for her girl workers, who need to be chosen carefully. The work is far too great a strain physically and mentally for girls under 20. Writing to a friend recently, a superintendent said with truth, "One's nerves need to be made of iron. I am wondering how much longer mine will stand the strain." This is a question that women must be asking themselves in almost every branch of war work today, for all work just now is at high pressure. But the women at home are inspired with the same spirit as the men in the trenches, and are equally prepared to go on until they drop. End of section 4.